principles of OAuth 2. Okay, thank you. And then today we are going to look at why do we use OAuth and how does it fit into Salesforce. So just as a recap, OAuth 2, according to the certification exam guide, is quite a big chunk of the Identity and Access Management certification exam. You need to be able to explain high-level concepts and flows of OAuth. You need to be able to troubleshoot common points of failure. You need to determine most appropriate flow type. And you need to be able to understand and describe the concepts, so the scopes and the tokens and the expirations and how to revoke them and that kind of stuff. So hopefully today's session will answer the majority of those questions. If we want to quickly recap what we did in episode 1, we know that OAuth is one of 3 protocols that Salesforce uses for identity. The other 2 are SAML and OpenID Connect. OAuth 2 has 4 main components that you need to understand. The first one are the roles or the actors. You have the resource owner, who's yourself. You have the resource server, where the information is that the client wants to access. You have the client, which is usually an app on a website or a mobile phone. And you have the authorization server. That's the server giving permission. And usually the resource server and the authorization server could be the same. For example, they're both Salesforce, but they just have different endpoints. Then the second component we needed to understand were the tokens. At a high level, there are 2 important tokens, the access token and the refresh token. So after you've been given authorization to access the resources on the resource server, you would then access those resources with an access token, which tells the resource server that yes, you have permission to access it. And then that access token you can then use a refresh token to request a new access token if the original access token has been expired. The third component was scopes and consent. So the scopes that is set by the authorization server tells you what services or what permissions are allowed for this client to access, as well which of the scopes are denied. And then we got to the bit that still confuses me, I guess, are the grants. So OAuth 2, and according to the OAuth 2 specification, there are 4 grants in OAuth. That's the authorization code grant, the implicit grant, the resource owner password credentials grant, and the client credentials grant. And that's kind of where we left off. We had a good look at these grants and how they work. And at the end of episode 1, we said we want to understand, and I think we ended with this slide, how do grants match up with Salesforce flows? Because we know there are lots of Salesforce flows. And there's only 4 types of grants. So today, that's what I want to do, because one of the most important things as an architect, you need to be able to understand these flows. And Salesforce has quite a bit of documentation on these flows, but I've always found them very confusing. They don't make sense to me. And today's slides hopefully will make sense to you guys, because it made it clear in my head on how it works. So let's get started with today. Oh, and just if you have a question, I can't see the participants. There's something wrong with my screen. So just shout, and then we can answer questions. You don't have to wait till the end.
Okay, there's Erin, Kate, and Kelly.
Okay, great. It's better if I don't know how many people are on. I'll just pretend I'm just chatting to you, Gemma.
Okay, just talk to me. I'm listening.
We're all
Therapy's in
friendly.
session. Yeah.
We're all friendly.
Yeah.
I know you.
We don't bite.
But it's still, I was saying to Gemma, this is my preparation for the CTA exam. One of my biggest things is I get nervous. I get extremely nervous to speak to people I don't know. And it's all in my mind. I know it. But this is helping a lot. I'm extremely nervous. I've got sweaty palms, and I'm probably going to have sweat on my brow soon. This is part of my preparation. So you guys are helping me a lot by listening to me yabber on.
Brilliant. That's what we're here for.
Good. Good.
Okay.
Absolutely. So breathe. Remember to breathe. Breathing is important.
Okay. Now I
There you go. Very good.
don't want to breathe too much. Just go through this. All right. So as a Salesforce developer, and according to all the documentations, there are 8 Salesforce flows, OAuth 2.0 flows. They are the web server, the user agent, the JOT bearer token, the device authentication flow, the asset token flow, the SAML bearer assertion flow, the SAML assertion flow, and the username and password flow. And then there's something else called the refresh token flow. So let's go figure out and try and map these to the authorization grants that we understand from the OAuth protocol. So let's get digging in. So first I went and had a look at the web server flow. According to Salesforce's documentation, the web server flow is used by apps that are hosted on a secure server. A critical aspect of the web server flow is that the server must be able to protect the consumer secret. And immediately I recognized this as the authorization code grant from our slides in the first episode. So you always should use the authorization code grant when the client is a web server. In other words, it's not just a front end, it's got a back end too. So let's go look at what the web server flow really looks like. So remember, we have our resource owner, a client, our auth server, and our resource server. Now, one of the things you need to be able to do at the CTA board and when you're an architect is be able to draw these OAuth flows. And as I was working through the slides and as I was drawing these, because I wanted to draw these out and not just take copies from images on the web, I realized that it's actually quite easy to draw these if you understand the story. And something I found that worked well for me is always drawing my 4 actors at the top and at the bottom, and draw a little line connecting them so that everything happens in the middle so you can trace where it came from and where it's going to. So that's just a bit of tip that I found really helpful. So let's look at the web server flow. If you remember from episode 1, the scenario is you're working on a website, it's got a backend, and this website wants some information about your Salesforce profile. So when you access that feature on the website, you are then redirected to an authorization server, which is the Salesforce authorization server. If you haven't logged in and given consent, you'll be presented with a little screen where it shows you which scopes are in play here. If you accept, the authorization server then responds with an authorization code to the client. And that portion is the user access, the authorization that has been given by the authorization server to the client. The client then takes that authorization code and it swaps it for an access token. So this is kind of an extra step for better security. When you swap the authorization code for the access token, the authorization server responds with an access token and a refresh token.
And is that if you put within the body of your request that you've actually asked for a refresh token, or will it just throw that back at you?
It depends on how the auth server is set up. A lot of how the auth server responds to the client are how the company or the service have implemented the authorization server. So they have the ability to either automatically give a refresh token or not give a refresh token, and then you need to request one.
Okay, thank you.
And then once the client has that access token, it can now hit the APIs. It can now hit the Salesforce standard APIs and get information because the resource server recognizes the access token. When the access token is expired and it hits one of those APIs, you're going to get an error back, which means the client will then request a new access token by sending the refresh token to the auth server. The auth server will recognize the refresh token and send back a new access token, and it can go back into its loop to request data responses from the API servers. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, especially within the context of what you said last week, because you said about how the access token is very, very short term, whereas the refresh token is designed to be longer term.
That's right, so that you can request new access tokens at a regular interval. And
the access token expiry, that comes back in the response from the authorization server, doesn't it? Okay.
That's right. Yeah.
I think I got it.
Yay!
Yay!
It's wonderful to understand it the first time, right? It's like, wow, I didn't know.
Well, this is horrible stuff. There's no denying it. But if you, I like the way you visualized it here with the owners going across the top, and then obviously you've contextualized it at the end to say now that the authorization server knows who we are and the resource server knows who we are, we can make requests and API calls and we can get the data.
Yeah.
So that helps you understand the integration much better.
So let's go back and look at the Salesforce documents, because that's where I get confused. I mean, I love Salesforce documents, but on this topic, not so much. So the flow that they've given looks like this. And they've given the steps nice and detailed. It is exactly what we've just said. It seems clunky to me.
Yeah.
So what I did is, this is the flow I drew, and this is their flow. And I sort of squashed the picture in here to try and make sense. So these three first steps is all part of the user request access section. And then getting the access token back is part of this lane. And then accessing the protected resources is this loop that we've drawn here.
Okay,
so
brilliant.
It does tie up. So those first three steps is the user request access. That's our step where we actually send the authorization code request. We get a code back. Then when we exchange the auth code for our access token and we get that access token and refresh token back, that's when the authorization is being given. And then we use that access token backwards and forwards to access the protected resources. So that's the web server flow. So what I'm doing, I'm filling in my grid. So what's the use case? It's used by apps that are hosted on a secure server. Which grant is it using? The authorization code grant. And just what are the benefits or drawbacks? This is the gold standard. This is most commonly used. It's optimized for server-side applications, and it's the ideal scenario, and it's the safer one, because access tokens are never sent through the front end. They're always sending access and authorization codes. And if somebody was able to get access to the authorization code, they still don't have an access code to send to the resource server. And if they get access to the access code, it's very short-lived. So if they don't have the refresh token, they can't request a new access. So that's why it's so secure. Okay, that was the web server flow. And I think the majority of the questions I got in the exam on this topic was about the web server flow. So it's good if you understand that one. Then let's look at the user agent flow. So according to Salesforce, and this also took a while to get my head around it because I didn't really know what is a desktop or mobile app. How's that different from a web server application? And then I went and looked for some examples, and one of the first examples I got was this little Salesforce contact screen that somebody built in Heroku. So it's basically just a front end. There's no data behind it. It's just two classes and a controller and some Heroku code that is pulling contacts from Salesforce and displaying it on either locally, as you can see in this URL, or on an app or on the browser. And that kind of made it more clear in my head on what do we mean when we say desktop or mobile apps. It's something that's actually just got a front end. And this, when you have an application of this type, this is when you use the user agent flow. So the user agent flow corresponds to the implicit grant. If you remember from our first episode, this is when when the client is running in the browser and when it's usually scripted or completely built with something like JavaScript or AngularJS. It's not an ideal scenario. It's one we don't want to use because the authorization, the access tokens are sent as a parameter at the back of the response back. So anybody who can hack the browser can get access to those tokens. So what I did is here, I went and I took the web server flow, which we just discussed, and I tried to build the user agent flow on it to see what's different. I want to understand the differences, not just what it is. So my client is now an AngularJS website. Note I have my clients at the top and the bottom again. And the user, the client, will request a token. It does not request an authorization code. From the first step, it requests a token. The authorization server, then if you haven't logged in and given consent, gives you that pop-up screen with the scopes. You say yes, and it then grants an access token and a refresh token. So the whole exchange of an auth code for an access token and then giving back the access token doesn't happen. It's skipping the whole first step of the authorization code, and it's directly dealing with an access token. And to me, that was the really big difference between the two. And it is because the client doesn't have a backend that can keep that information secure. And then once it's got the access token, it's the same thing over again. Calls the APIs, and it gets a response back until the access token expires. Then it uses the refresh token, hits the auth server again, gets a new access token, and goes back into the loop. And that's it. That's the user agent flow.
So what use cases can you see for this flow?
So for exactly this kind of application, if you have a Heroku application that does, I'm not really quite sure, but if you have an Angular application that needs some information from Salesforce or from Facebook or from Google, but it doesn't want to store it. It hasn't got a Postgres or a MySQL database. So it just wants to display it in the application or allow you to create new ones. You would use the user agent flow because you cannot keep the client secret or any authorization code secret. So you can't use the web server flow.
Okay. So, I mean, I've had a recent situation with a client where they actually have this happening within their own servers. They have a lot of on-premise applications that talk to one another, and actually they're not storing anything anywhere. They're just displaying it. So you could argue it's almost like a canvas situation, only with canvas you're opening a window into the data, whereas here you're just kind of saying, pull this data, just display it on a screen, but don't save anything. And I can see why you wouldn't want to necessarily deploy this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm unmuted.
No, whoops, I muted the wrong person. Apologies.
No
Massive
worries.
fail.
That's okay. So let's just look at the Salesforce doc. The client app directs the user to Salesforce to log in if you haven't logged in before. You authorize the flow. Then the app receives a call back from Salesforce. And after the client or consumer has an access token, it can then access the protected resources. So it does make the documents, because this, I never understood how this is different, but let's impose that again. So we have our clients at the top, or our roles at the top. Then we have this user request access part, and they get access to access protected resources. And the whole authorization code exchange doesn't happen. Okay, fill in my grid. So user agent, we now know it's used by client apps that reside on the user's device or computer. And sorry, those are my dogs. The front door just opened by itself. I think there's a ghost. Guys, I'm going to have to go close that door.
Certainly, yeah, just take your time.
It's okay, my husband's going to sort that out. Yes, so the use case is that the app or the client resides on the user's device or computer, or running completely in the browser using such scripting language like JavaScript. It is the implicit grant, and this type of authorization should only be used if you can't use any other type of authorization. And it's the least secure because the access token is exposed on the client side. All right, let's go to the next one. The next one is the username and password flow. So according to Salesforce, you use the username and password authentication flow to authenticate when the consumer already has the user's credentials. In this flow, the user's credentials are used by the application to request an access token as shown in the following steps. Now, remember when we looked at the resource owner password credentials grant? Remember, the resource owner is me, myself, the end user. So if I've already given my username and password, then the client can just use that and go and request. And it's usually when I'm on a Salesforce app and I want to get information from Salesforce for my Salesforce app. Or if I'm on my Pinterest app and it actually has to go and get data from the Pinterest servers, resource servers. I've already authenticated. I've already got my username and password entered into the client. So this is the username and password flow. The client just takes that username and password that it's already storing and it's sending it to the authorization server. And because it's the same service, there's no security issues. Let's have a look at it. So I log in and authenticate with my credentials. I do that first. Then the client sends that username and password and it sends it to the auth server requesting an access token. Again, no authorization code. It's requesting an access token. The auth server then gives back the access token and I can go into my loop. And it's all because the client already had my username and password for this service because the client and the service is the same thing. Any questions?
Just thinking about use case again. So if you have a mobile phone, let's say you have an iPhone and you log into the website and it saves your credentials in your password section. Sorry, it's getting a bit loud in here.
Okay.
You save your username and password on the iPhone as credentials, and then it just remembers them so that next time you go back to the site, it automatically pre-fills them in. I mean, you're still authenticating with your credentials. I don't know if that's the right scenario or not. I'm trying to apply it to a real life scenario.
The Salesforce app to me is it's a clear-cut one. So if I download Salesforce on my mobile phone,
Yeah.
the application, so I've downloaded from the App Store, and the first time I go try and log in, it asks me for a login screen. So I put in my Salesforce username and password. Now, if Salesforce is the Salesforce app, the mobile app, needs to go and get information from the Salesforce org, for example, show all my accounts or show my chatter feed, it has to somehow, this is still just a mobile application. It still needs to make a call to my Salesforce org backend to get that information and to show it. And how does it do it? It uses my username and password that it's already got. And the reason why it's okay is because the Salesforce app is from the same company as the Salesforce org. So they implicitly trust each other.
Okay, I'm with you. Thank you.
Okay. And everything happens so seamless on our apps. That's why we don't realize there's like a million steps in the middle.
Yeah, have you noticed if you've ever hooked up your smart TV to a streaming service that you actually sit there and go, I know what that is. That's a device authentication flow. And all your family are looking at you like you've got 16 heads.
I did that this morning. I know what that is. I realized what's happening and I could see the URL changing. And I said, oh, it's doing it. And people were just looking at me going, what?
Okay, Charlie. Yay.
Take your medication. Don't stop. All right. So according to the document for the user password flow, the application uses the username and password, and it sends that to the authorization server and requests an access token. So here's the example of the endpoint. You'd go to salesforce.com/services/OAuth2/token, and that's the token endpoint. We did that in the first episode. Salesforce then verifies the user credentials and successful sends a response to the application with the access token. The application then uses the provided access token to access the protected user data. So since the user is never redirected to log in to Salesforce, the Salesforce org, and the user can't directly authorize the application, there's no refresh tokens. So remember, so far it's only the web server and the user agent that got refresh tokens. The user password, username and password do not get a refresh token because the user never gave direct authorization. The app is doing it automatically using credentials it's storing. Okay. And then if we take Salesforce's picture and overlay it on ours, it's the same. We request the access token using the credentials. The server verifies the credentials. It sends the access token back, and it then uses that access to that access token to access protected resources. The nice thing that I found while going through these flows in so much detail is it's all pretty much the same thing. It's just slight differences on where it starts or where it ends. And I could never understand that from Salesforce's drawings because it doesn't show all the actors. So there were things missing. So this makes sense to me. So then I filled in the grid. For the username and password, authentication happens when the consumer already has the user's credentials. The user credentials are used by the app to request an access token. It's the resource owner password grant. It's mainly used when the client has been developed by the same authority as the authorization server. And the user would not be surprised to type in his login password on the site. So it's not like I'm surprised, oh, now I'm going to Twitter and I was expecting to go to Facebook, because it's all the same authorization. And it's an access token. I was trying to keep track of which flows uses an authorization code as the first step versus going straight to access tokens. So I added a column for that. Okay, now the device authentication flow. Now, if you go back to our list of grants, there is no grant. There were 4 grants, and none of them were the device authentication or device grant. So I had to go find it. In 2015, there was an amendment made to the OAuth 2.0 protocol. So if you go look at the official OAuth 2.0 protocol documents on the internet, the ones that were released in 2007, there's only 4 grants. But then if you go and look at the later amendments, there is a device flow grant that they added. And it is because technology is changing, right? So you can see the date here as well. This was amended in October 2017, which is not that long ago. And this is exactly what you were saying about, Gemma. This is for browserless and input-constrained devices, like when you're in a hotel and you want to access Netflix and you don't want to type in your username and password using the arrows on the remote, because that's just torture.
Yeah, that made me cry the other day when I tried to log on to an app and it was like, please give me your username. I was like, really? In this day and age?
So if they use the device authentication OAuth flow, it would have redirected, it would have given you, and we're going to go through it in detail, it would have given you a URL and a code and said, go there on another device, type in the code, and we would take care of the authorization. And that's what the device authentication flow is all about. So let's have a look at it. I had to add another extra actor, and this is the second client, because you now have to, on my PlayStation 4 or my hotel TV or whichever client I'm on, and I want to access my Netflix account. An authorization code request is sent to the Netflix authorization server. The server returns a user code, a verification URL, and a device code response to, let's stick to my PlayStation 4. I then, and this gets displayed to me, the resource owner. I then go to a different client, now on my phone or my laptop, and I access that URL and enter the code. This whole time, the client has been polling the authorization server to see if it will release an access token already. And because I've entered the URL and entered the code into the second client, the authorization server now releases an access token response. So my PlayStation 4 now has an access token, and what does it do? It accesses the movies and whatever I'm entitled to on the resource server. I think it's very clever. I like this. All right, so let's see what the Salesforce docs. The Salesforce drawing is confusing, but it's what we said, the device, the PlayStation 4 request authorization from Salesforce. Salesforce verifies the request and then returns in human readable format a code, a verification URL, a device code, and a minimum polling interval in seconds. And that polling interval is what the client is going to use to poll the authorization server for an access code. So the user then goes to a separate device that's got input capabilities, and it goes to that URL, it enters the user code. If the code is valid and it is accepted by the resource server or the authorization server, you are redirected to log in if you're not already logged in, and then you can give permission according to the scopes of what this client can access. And remember, the client original, the PlayStation 4, is still polling the authorization server for an access token at the token endpoint, and the polling frequency is what has been returned back by the authorization server in the initial request. And now my client gets that access token, and it can now use it to access the protected resources. So if we overlay the two, it fits. We have our clients, we do the initial device, which is an extra step we haven't had before. Then we give the user authentication, the user request access, and then the access is granted and they can access the protected resources. And that's the device authentication flow. So I filled in and I had to specify the new grant we didn't know about previously. So now we've got a device flow grant as well. So the use case is for browserless and input constrained devices. And the benefits and the drawbacks is the device flow grant provides a really pleasant experience for devices that do not support an easy data entry method. In addition, it's really simple for developers to integrate with. And it's got an access token and not an authorization code. I don't think I've ever seen a question on this in any of the exams, but I'm sure it'll be added to exams in due time.
No, but I found it the easiest to understand because of the amount of smart TVs and PS4s and Netflix and everything else. We see it so often in our daily life.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure what the business use case is, but it'll probably be something like a business Alexa.
Potentially, or a box. So if I mean, I once did it for an online streaming business, and they sell a box. So you know, I can see it for that.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so moving on. I just want to go back. So remember, we read in the Salesforce document the refresh token flow, and it's not part of the 8 main flows. So let's have a look at the refresh token flow. We know where the refresh tokens are being used. We know it's when an access token has expired and the client tries to access the resource server and it says, your access token has expired, and it gives back an error. The client then hits the authorization server again saying, here's my refresh token, give me a new access token. So let's just go and look at that little refresh token flow and what that looks like and how it works. So I've taken out the 3 other lanes out of the flow. I've kept my my actors, and when the client calls the auth server and it gives it a refresh token, the auth server gives it back an access token. And then it'll go do what it needs to do until the access token expires, and then it'll take the refresh token, because remember, a refresh token stays alive a very long time, and then it sends it to the auth server and it gets a new access token. And that, in a nutshell, is the refresh token flow. The important thing here that you as an architect need to know is that this forms part of the web server and the user agent flows, and that there are specific parameters that you need to send. So this is the Salesforce documentation. This drawing shows a whole web server flow instead of just showing that you're requesting data with an expired access token, get an error, you request a token then with the refresh token, the refresh token is given, and you then could request service data from the resource server backwards and forwards, and that's 6, 7, 8, 9 is the loop. And 2, 3, and 4 is just us sending an expired access token, getting an error, and then sending the refresh token and getting a valid access token. So this drawing finally makes sense to me too. And now we need to just understand the things that we need to send when we do the first request for an access token with a refresh token, and also what is going to be sent back to the client from Salesforce. I'm not going to go through all of this, but it is important, so you do need to go and read through it and understand the type of information that you can expect, because there are questions about this in the exam. All right, so now I didn't fill anything else in because the refresh token is actually just a small mini flow inside the web server and user agent flow. I want to show you. No, maybe I shouldn't show you. I have notes all over the office of all my, as I study, I make these, I'd write and I draw pictures. And this is how I tried to learn the flows the first time. And needless to say, I never understood any of this because it all seemed to me in my mind, according to the docs, to be similar types of flows, but they're not. The refresh token flow is only a mini flow that's part of the web server or user agent flow. Now that said, let's look at the jot bearer token flow. The jot bearer token flow is also a mini flow. It's also something that happens inside our other main flows. So when you request an access token from the authorization server, you can make it more secure by adding a jot bearer token. That's it in a nutshell. It's the same flow we know and understand. The client is hitting the auth server for an access token. The authorization server recognizes it and sends an access token back. That's it. This time only, the request to the auth server is signed with an encrypted digital certificate, which makes this a more secure and more seamless process. It just adds an extra layer to the access token process. And that is the jot bearer token flow. There's lots of information and lots of documentation, and we'll put it all in the resource servers. We don't have time to go into detail, but it was important that you understand where it fits in. Any questions on this? Okay, so I took out the column saying jot bearer token flow because it's not a big flow. It's a mini flow. It's just the way that access token is requested by using digitally encrypted signed certificates. And you can use it in any of the big flows. There is one caveat though. If you're using the web server flow, and if your access token is requested using the jot bearer token, then you cannot get a refresh token. That's the caveat. You will not get a refresh token back. Okay. Device authentication flow. And this is where we're getting into the Internet of Things. Oh, I have the wrong heading on the wrong slide.
That's okay. It's an asset token flow.
It's the asset token flow, yes. So just ignore the heading. I'll fix that up. The asset token flow is used by client apps to request an asset token from Salesforce for connected devices. So I was first battling to understand how is it different from the device authentication flow, which we've just done, the PS4s and the smart TVs and the hotel TVs. How is that different from the asset token flow? The asset token flow is used by using an actor token that you exchange for an asset token. And using the actor token, you can now integrate with Service Cloud. You can create asset records in this flow in Salesforce, or update asset records, or get information about existing asset records back. So it's important to know that when we talk about assets in the asset token flow, we're talking about the record, the object, assets, where you store products and things that you've sold to your customer. And that this flow allows you to update that. So let's have a quick look here. It's the same flow again. You exchange either your authorization code in the web server flow for an access token, or you request it using the user agent flow, but you're using an asset token JOT. So in the JOT bearer asset flow, you could send this JSON package of a digital certificate to the auth server. This time you are doing similar. It's also JSON, it's also a JOT bearer, but it is an asset token, which basically means you've just added a whole lot of extra functionality, parameters into that request, into that JSON packet that you are sending to the auth server, so that the authorization server gives you an access token that allows the client to update and create and work with assets like connected devices on the resource server in Salesforce. Does that make sense to you guys?
Yep.
Okay. So we just talked about this flow. I'm just curious, I'm just conscious of time. It's 1:45. The time goes past so quickly. But we're going to give these slides to everybody, right? So there's lots of notes in here and lots of information so that everybody can go through this and just make sure they understand it.
Yes, we'll post them into the community group.
So go back to my grid. I removed my asset token column because it's not really a big flow. It's just using, requesting an access token using an asset token JOT, so that I can work with my IoT devices, which are stored as assets in Salesforce with the Service Cloud functionality. All right. Let's look at the SAML bearer assertion flow. Now, usually when I hear the SAML, my eyes go all weird because it just, so a SAML, it's just very confusing. But now, a SAML assertion is an XML security token issued by an identity provider and consumed by a service provider. So you need to understand the whole SAML and single sign-on in order to understand the SAML bearer assertion. But in a nutshell, is if I have a client that has used single sign-on to sign into a service, then I already have authorization. I can then use that authorization, that SAML authorization, put it into a token form, which we call the SAML bearer assertion, and send that to the authorization server. The authorization server will recognize it, say, oh, yeah, we already gave them authorization as part of single sign-on that happened earlier, so let's give them an access token, which will allow the client then to hit the resource server into the loop so that they can access the resources. So the SAML bearer assertion flow is just using a previously obtained authorization, which was obtained through single sign-on, to go and request an access token from the authorization server. Here's the Salesforce document. It's exactly the same. The client requests a token from the auth server, just like we've done in every other flow, but this time it adds the SAML assertion. The authorization server recognizes the SAML assertion and it sends a response. It sends the access token back. And then the client can access the protected resources on the resource server using the access token, as we know. And that's it. Oh, also another thing, a refresh token, another caveat. This is a typical web server flow or either a user agent flow, but remember, whenever we go using a JOS or a SAML assertion, then we can no longer get refresh tokens. I'm not sure why, to be very honest, but that's what they teach us. As soon as you change your request for an access token to a JOS bearer or a SAML assertion bearer or a SAML assertion, then you do not get a refresh token back. All right, so I went and removed that column as well because it's not a real flow. It is a type of assertion that you add onto your access request, access token request, because you have done single sign-on previously. So it's not a main flow, it's a type of mini flow.
Thank you for explaining that. I always struggled to see where it fit, and the table is a really, really good way to learn, I think. So thank you.
Well, no one has ever documented this way, so it makes sense in my head. I'm just hoping it's correct.
Yeah, well, we'll soon find out, won't we?
Yes. And I think at some of the slides I added a caution triangle saying, okay, this isn't documented anywhere, so I'm just going through this and trying to teach myself.
Yeah.
And so far it makes sense.
It's not easy. This is pretty difficult to understand because it seems to have been written in developer language. And
the other thing is I've watched so many Dreamforce videos and other videos saying OAuth demystified and we'll explain it dumbed down, but all they do is just reiterating the same documentation and drawings over and over and over again. And it's not, I needed logically explained how does it tie into things.
Yeah.
And so we hope this is correct, but I think it is. It works. If you go build it this way, it'll work.
Yeah,
So.
It looks right to me.
All right, so the last one is SAML assertion. The difference between SAML bearer assertion and SAML assertion is SAML assertion is only when Salesforce talks to itself. It's inside a single org, and you do not need a connected app. But the rest of it's the same. It means that authorization was already given through a single sign-on process. So the client can take that single sign-on process, assertion, wrap it into its request for an access token from the authorization server, and that will tell the auth server that you've already got an authorization from the single sign-on process, and it'll give you an access token back. So the only use case I could think of, and it'll be nice if somebody else could maybe think and help me come up with more use cases, where if I am logging in with, if I'm single signing on with my company credentials into my Salesforce, using my Salesforce app, and my app, which is the client, is then connecting to my Salesforce org. Because it needs to be the same. It needs to be that implicit trust. And the documentation is very clear. It says it's only inside a single org. But you've obviously single signed on into this org using some identity provider credentials. So that's the only use case I could come up with for this flow. It'll be interesting to see if somebody can come up with something else. All right, then according to the documentation, it's pretty much the same as the SAML bearer assertion. It's just that it's all inside the same org. So back to my graph, I removed my last column and added a list here, SAML assertion. So this made sense to me, right? We have 4 inherent authorization grants that is provided by the OAuth protocol. Salesforce has pretty much the same way of handling OAuth. It just depends on what your token looks like. It depends on whether you are sending a JOT package with a digital signature. It depends on whether you have single signed on into your client and you're using that same assertion to get into the resources. And it depends on whether you're in a single environment. And that's the difference between using the web server flow, the user agent flow, the device authentication flow, and the username and password flow. So the next thing is how to go make this work. So everything we learned today should be able to give you all the information you need to be able to identify which flow you need to use.
and what's important about those flows. But now going to do this into Salesforce is creating a connected app and filling in all the fields. And I didn't document that. I'm happy to do another mini session or something on that, but it's so well documented in Trailhead, and it's very sort of straightforward. You go to App Manager, you say new connected app, you fill in everything. We understand what the endpoint URLs are now. We understand what scopes are. We understand whether you want to use a web server or a device flow, so you know which tick box to check. And then you hit save. You then get a client ID and a client secret, which we know we have to go give to the client. And that's now the client just needs to know which endpoints to hit. And that is how you implement OAuth. So yes, I am happy. I didn't document these 3 steps, but I'm happy if we want to go through that at some other time.
Oh, that's perfect. Charlie, if you want to go through that, then you're most welcome to. Equally, if you wanted to just put a couple of slides together and post them into the group for people, then you know, we'd welcome that as well. I think this slide really nicely summarizes the role of OAuth 2 in integration. Certainly, whether you're using middleware or whether you're doing point-to-point, whichever pattern you decide to use. Obviously with the exception of outbound, but this is really important stuff to understand, and it really does tie it really nicely together with integration. Also, some feedback as well on your presenting style. I love the way that you have shown us your thought process in trying to understand that, and you've been very honest and candid about the documentation, about how it is difficult to understand, and the subject matter is so heavy. But I really like the way that you've built up that table and you've built up the flows. It just makes it so much easier. So, you know, I can't thank you enough for doing that. It's going to help a lot of people, I think.
That's my pleasure. Yeah. So you're not going to get off that easy, though. I have a little bit of a quiz for you.
Awesome.
All right. So let's quickly, we only have a couple of minutes. So let's say we're a company and we have an internal recruiting system. I purposely did not draw any arrows because you're going to have to help me with this. We have an internal recruiting system. We've got a web app. We have Salesforce. We have MuleSoft, and we have a bunch of legacy systems. So pretty much any company today we work with. Now, let's look at the recruiting system. The candidate's information should be available in Salesforce automatically when they are selected. After the hiring process. Our company needs to use OAuth to connect Salesforce, connect to Salesforce, and need to do the authentication using digital certificates. Which 2 OAuth flows should we consider?
Digital certificates. Jot.
Yes. It's easier if you see the options, right?
Yeah, feel free to chime in, guys. Jot is the first thing that springs to mind. Second of all is the web server authentication flow. And I've probably got that wrong.
Anybody else? So let me tell you, the four options given on this question is Jot bearer token, refresh token, SAML bearer assertion, and web service. So yes, Jot definitely, because we know that's all about digital certificates. So process of elimination, refresh token flow. Refresh token flow is not a real flow, right? It's a mini flow.
It's a mini flow.
So that's just no. Then you have the SAML bearer assertion flow and the web service flow. Now the web service flow doesn't by default use certificates.
Right, okay. So could it be?
It's the SAML bearer assertion flow.
SAML bearer.
Yeah. Apparently, because of the SAML assertion contains certificates as well. The authorization that came from single sign-on.
Okay.
So that's the type of stuff you need to learn when you go, and you have to really go into each one of these flows and learn what gets sent backwards and forwards. Because each one of them, so the Jot token, bearer token, and the SAML assertion token, they have different parameters, which makes them different. So you need to go and learn that. That's not something I can explain to you. It's just you need to go and learn that. And if you learn that, you would know that the SAML bearer and the Jot bearer token uses digital certificates.
Okay.
All right, the next one, let's quickly do this. We use MuleSoft to integrate multiple systems. But no, the company came and said, no username and passwords can be stored in any company system, legacy or new. So how can MuleSoft authenticate to Salesforce and adhere to this requirement? So no username and password. The options are create a connected app that supports the JotBearer token, create a connected app that supports the refresh token, create a connected app that supports the web server, and create a connected app that supports the user agent flow. So no usernames and passwords. Any idea? So the JotBearer, am I still here? I think so.
Yeah, you're still here.
Mm-hmm. So the JotBearer doesn't exchange a username and password. The refresh token is a mini flow. They always put that in there to confuse us. The web server OAuth flow does share username and passwords. And the user agent. So the answer is the Jot and the user agent, which doesn't use usernames and passwords. All right, next one is the company wants to integrate a web application with Salesforce. We have used the web server authentication flow. Which two things are important when we use the web server authentication flow? A, the web application should be on a secure server. B, the web server must be able to protect consumer privacy. C, the flow involves passing the user credentials back and forth. And D, the flow will not provide an OAuth refresh token back.
I think it's A and D.
So D says the flow will not provide an OAuth refresh token back.
Oh no, that is wrong.
Yeah. A is right.
D.
It should be secure. And B, it must
Yeah.
be able to protect the consumer privacy.
Yeah.
So these are actual questions I remember from the exam. So it's not word by word, but it's how and I wrote them down right after the exam. So I don't know if they'll ever be on the exam if one of you take them. And I'm not sharing, I'm just sharing the concepts of them. Because I did say I will not share exam questions. But it's important to be able to understand the scenarios and say, process of elimination, why it wouldn't work. And that is me. Thank you, guys. I'm going to hand it over to Gemma.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you very much for taking the time. That's 2 hours of your very precious time that you've spent to take us through this. So I can't thank you enough. One of the things that I wanted to do before we sign off and let Charlie go and have a break and we rest our dribbling brains is just to invite you to come along to an event that we're running on the 20th of March. Again, it's all completely virtual, and I've got two very special guests to bring to you. One of them is Joyna Popper, who is a certified technical architect. She was one of the first in the UK. And the other is Deborah Maranta, who many of you will be familiar with because she runs the architect program at Salesforce. So she's going to come along and talk to us about why the architect path is such a career-changing path to take, and some of the benefits that you can get, and some of the ways that Salesforce is changing their process to help people become better architects and use the skills that they've learned through the architect program to deliver great results. So she's going to come along and talk to us on that. It's at 7 o'clock UK time, so that would probably be around lunchtime in the US. We would love to have you come along. It'll be exactly the same credentials as the last few study groups. So with that, I'm going to keep tweeting as well, keep making sure that it gets the message gets out there. The idea is that you come along and get some inspiration from these fantastic ladies, and also fantastic lady who's just run these last two sessions as well. Yeah. So thank you so much for all of your time and for all of your attention. I'm going to wrap up for now, and I'll make the recording available soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Gemma. Thanks, everyone.